The sea was more than just water to the Vikings. It was their highway, their battlefield, and their proving ground. Picture this, a fleet of longships cutting through the icy waves, their dragon-headed prows gleaming under the pale glow of the northern sky. These weren't just boats, they were symbols of power, carrying warriors who would strike fear into the hearts of kingdoms across Europe. The Vikings didn't just sail the seas, they ruled them, and their naval battles were the stuff of legend. Today, we're stepping back into that world of wind, wood, and warfare to uncover the 20 biggest Viking naval battles that shaped the course of history. What made these clashes so extraordinary? It wasn't just the sheer scale of the fleets or the ferocity of the fighters, though both were unmatched. It was the way these battles decided the fate of empires. A single day on the water could mean the rise of a new king or the fall of a dynasty. From the fjords of Norway to the coasts of England, Viking ships became the ultimate weapons, and their commanders wielded them with ruthless precision. These weren't just random skirmishes, they were calculated, high-stakes gambles where every oar stroke and every arrow could tip the balance of power. So why do these battles still captivate us centuries later? Perhaps it's the audacity of the Vikings sailing into unknown waters, facing overwhelming odds and still emerging victorious. Or maybe it's the legacy they left behind, etching their stories into the very landscapes they once conquered. As we journey through these 20 epic confrontations, you'll see how Viking naval dominance wasn't just about brute strength, it was about strategy, innovation, and an unshakable will to win. So ready your sea legs and sharpen your axe, because we're about to dive deep into the battles that defined an age. The northern seas were their stage, and this is how they claimed it. To truly grasp how the Vikings dominated the seas, we need to look at the very foundation of their power, their ships. The iconic longship wasn't just a vessel, it was a masterpiece of engineering designed for speed, agility, and versatility. With their shallow drafts, these ships could glide effortlessly through shallow rivers or brave the open ocean, giving Viking raiders an unmatched advantage. Imagine a fleet appearing seemingly out of nowhere, striking coastal towns before defenders could even sound the alarm. That element of surprise was no accident. It was built into every plank and rivet of their ships. But it wasn't just about the design. The Vikings were master navigators, reading the stars, winds, and waves with an almost instinctive precision. Without compasses or modern maps, they ventured as far west as North America and as far east as the rivers of Russia. Their knowledge of currents and tides turned the vast, unpredictable sea into a familiar highway, one they could traverse with confidence. This wasn't just exploration, it was a deliberate strategy to control trade routes, establish settlements, and project power far beyond their homelands. Raiding was only part of the story. While the image of Vikings as ruthless plunderers endures, their maritime prowess also fueled a vast network of commerce and diplomacy. From the bustling markets of Hedeby to the trade routes linking Constantinople to the north, Viking ships carried everything from furs and amber to silver and slaves. Their ability to navigate both war and trade made them indispensable players in medieval Europe's political landscape. A successful raid could topple a king, while a well-timed trade deal could secure an alliance. And then there was the sheer ambition of their leaders. Viking chieftains didn't just want wealth, they sought legacy. Controlling the seas meant controlling destiny, whether through founding new kingdoms like Normandy or carving out territories in distant lands. Every voyage, every battle was a step toward immortality in the sagas. When we examine their greatest naval clashes, we're not just looking at fights over gold or land. we're witnessing the moments that defined empires. The stage was set, and the Vikings were ready to write history with their oars and axes. The year was 845, and the Vikings were about to make history. As spring thawed the rivers of Francia, a fleet of over 120 longships cut through the Seine's currents like a blade through silk. At their helm stood Ragnar Lothbrok, a name that would echo through the ages, part warrior, part legend. This wasn't just another raid, it was a calculated strike at the heart of a kingdom. Paris, the jewel of Charles the Bald's realm, lay vulnerable, its stone walls no match for Viking ambition. What made this attack so audacious wasn't just the scale, it was the strategy. The Vikings didn't rely on brute force alone. They exploited the Seine's winding path, navigating waters that Franks assumed would protect them. While Charles scrambled to rally his forces, Ragnar's fleet split into smaller groups, surrounding the city from multiple angles. Panic spread through Paris as smoke darkened the sky. The Vikings had turned the river itself into a weapon, using it to strike where defenses were weakest. The siege lasted barely a week, but its impact would last centuries. Facing certain destruction, Charles made a desperate choice. He offered the Vikings 7,000 pounds of silver to leave. It was a staggering sum, enough to buy loyalty, fund armies, or build fleets. For Ragnar, it was proof that even kings could be broken. The message was clear: Viking power couldn't be ignored, only bought off for a time. But the real legacy of Paris lay in what came next. News of the raid spread like wildfire, chilling the courts of Europe. If a fortified city like Paris could fall, nowhere was safe. Monasteries doubled their guards, kings fortified their riverbanks, and traders whispered of dragon-proud ships in every fogbank. The Vikings had done more than plunder a city, they'd rewritten the rules of warfare. From that day forward, every ruler knew the sea wasn't a barrier. It was a highway for conquest, yet the siege also revealed a paradox. The Vikings weren't just destroyers, they were master negotiators. Ragnar took the silver, but he also took something far more valuable: recognition. Charles's ransom wasn't just payment, it was an admission. The Franks, like so many others, had learned the hard way: when the longships came, the world would bend. And this was only the beginning. The waters of Hafrsfjord were about to witness history in the making. In the year 872, under a sky heavy with the promise of battle, King Harald Fairhair assembled the largest fleet Norway had ever seen. This wasn't just another petty squabble between Viking warlords, it was the culmination of decades of ambition. Harald had sworn an oath not to cut his hair until he ruled all of Norway, and now, with his legendary golden mane flowing, he stood ready to make good on that vow. The rival chieftains who dared oppose him would soon learn the price of defiance. What set Hafizjord apart wasn't just the scale of the confrontation, but the stakes. Norway was a patchwork of feuding clans, each clinging to their own sliver of coastline. Harald understood that true power lay in unity, and the sea was his battlefield. His strategy was simple but devastating: lure his enemies into a fjord where their smaller fleets would be trapped like fish in a net. As the opposing ships crowded into Hafrsfjord's narrow waters, they found themselves outmaneuvered before the first arrow flew. Harald's forces attacked from multiple angles, their longships slicing through the chaos with terrifying precision. The battle raged for hours, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. Harald's numerical advantage and disciplined warriors overwhelmed the fractured resistance. By day's end, the fjord ran red, and the surviving chieftains faced a grim choice: swear allegiance or face annihilation. This was more than a military victory, it was the birth of a nation. For the first time, Norway stood united under a single crown, its destiny forever altered by the clash of oars and the cries of warriors. Yet Hafrsfjord's legacy extended far beyond the fjord itself. Harald's triumph sent shockwaves across Scandinavia, proving that a strong leader could bend the chaotic Viking world to his will. The decentralized age of petty kingdoms was ending, replaced by centralized power that would shape Norway's future. Trade routes stabilized, laws were standardized, and the raids that once defined Viking life gave way to the demands of a growing kingdom. Those who resisted the new order found themselves exiled, some fleeing as far as Iceland, carrying with them the seeds of Norse culture to distant shores. Harald's victory also revealed something deeper about Viking society. These weren't mindless marauders, they were builders of nations. The same ships that had carried raiders to foreign coasts now served a king's vision, transforming a fractured land into a realm that could stand alongside Europe's rising powers. When Harald finally cut his hair after the battle, it wasn't just a personal milestone, it was a symbol of Norway's coming of age. The Battle of Hafrsfjord didn't just change the map, it changed what it meant to be a Viking. The waters off Svolder Island churned with more than waves in the year 1000. They seethed with betrayal. King Olaf Tryggvason, the fiery Norwegian ruler who had championed Christianity across the north, found himself encircled by a coalition of enemies he once called allies. Danish King Sweyn Forkbeard, Swedish King Olaf Skirtkonung, and even Olaf's own former brother-in-arms, the Jarl Eirik of Lade, had joined forces to dismantle his rule. This wasn't just a battle for territory, it was a clash of ideologies where the Old Norse gods and the rising Christian faith collided on the decks of longships. Olaf's fleet, though outnumbered, was no easy target. His flagship, the legendary Long Serpent, stood as a floating fortress, longer, taller, and more formidable than any other vessel in the north. Its sides were lined with shields painted in vivid colors, and its crew consisted of the most loyal warriors, each handpicked for their skill and devotion. As the enemy closed in, Olaf's men fought with the desperation of those who knew surrender meant annihilation. The air filled with the snap of bowstrings, the clash of steel, and the war cries of men fighting for their king and their faith. But betrayal tipped the scales. Eirik of Lade, once Olaf's ally, exploited his intimate knowledge of Norwegian tactics, directing his ships to isolate the Long Serpent. The battle turned into a brutal melee, with Danish and Swedish forces swarming Olaf's remaining ships. Despite the chaos, Olaf refused to flee. Legend claims he stood atop the Serpent's prow in full armor, hurling spears until the very end. When the deck became indefensible, he chose the sea over capture, leaping into the waves rather than yielding to his enemies. His disappearance became one of the greatest mysteries of the Viking Age. Some claimed he drowned, while others whispered he escaped to live in secret. The fallout from Svolder reshaped Scandinavia. With Olaf gone, Norway was carved up between the victors, and Christianity's advance stalled as pagan rulers reclaimed influence. Yet the battle also revealed the fragile nature of Viking alliances. Sweyn and Olaf had united against a common foe, but their partnership dissolved almost immediately after victory, proving that even the mightiest coalitions were temporary. Svolder wasn't just a naval battle, it was a turning point where faith, loyalty, and ambition collided, leaving a legacy far deeper than the wreckage at the bottom of the sea. What makes Svolder so fascinating isn't just the tactics or the scale, but the human drama. Olaf's defiance, Eirik's betrayal, and the shifting loyalties of kings and jarls show that Viking warfare was never just about strength. It was a chess game played on the waves where every move carried the weight of kingdoms, and though Olaf's body was never found, his legend endured, a reminder that even in defeat, a king's name could outlast the swords that sought to silence him. Winter still gripped the Norwegian coast in the year 1016 when Olaf Haraldsson made his move. The young Viking prince, later known as Saint Olaf, wasn't just fighting for a crown, he was fighting for the soul of Norway. His rivals, the Jarls Svein and Einar, represented the old order clinging to pagan traditions and regional power, but Olaf had a vision, a united Christian kingdom under his rule. The stage was set at Nesjar, where icy waters and rocky shores would decide the future of a nation. What made Nesjar extraordinary wasn't the size of the fleets, it was Olaf's brilliance in exploiting the terrain. Unlike the open clashes at Hafrsfjord or Svolder, this battle hinged on positioning. Olaf lured his enemies into a narrow sound near the modern-day town of Larvik, where their numbers meant nothing. The confined space turned the battle into a brutal ship-to-ship brawl, favoring Olaf's hand-picked warriors over the less disciplined forces of the Jarls. As the longships crashed together, the air filled with the splintering of oars and the shouts of men fighting for every inch of deck. Olaf's tactical genius shone brightest in the chaos. While his opponents struggled to maneuver in the tight waters, he used the current and wind to his advantage, pinning their ships against the rocky shoreline. His archers rained fire arrows onto the trapped vessels, turning the fjord into a scene of smoke and flame. The Jarls' alliances crumbled under the pressure. Svein fell early in the fighting, and Einar, seeing the tide turn, abandoned the struggle. By midday, what had begun as a bid for power became a rout. Olaf's victory wasn't just military, it was psychological. The surviving Jarls bent the knee, realizing resistance was futile. But Nesjar's impact went far beyond the battlefield. With his rivals subdued, Olaf accelerated Norway's conversion to Christianity, tearing down pagan temples and building churches in their place. His reign saw the first unified legal code, blending Norse tradition with Christian ethics. The battle proved that Viking warfare wasn't just about strength, it was about adaptability. Olaf had taken a fractured pagan land and forged it into a kingdom that could stand beside Europe's rising Christian powers. Yet the battle also revealed the cost of ambition. Many of Olaf's own men perished in the fighting, and his heavy-handed tactics earned him enemies who would later betray him. Nesjar was both his crowning achievement and a warning, a reminder that even the cleverest strategies couldn't shield a king from the consequences of his choices. The fjord where the battle raged is quiet now, but the echoes of that day still shape Norway's identity. Olaf's victory didn't just win him a throne, it set in motion the transformation of a Viking warlord into a national saint. The summer of 1026 brought a storm of ships to the mouth of Sweden's Helgia River, not a storm of nature but of ambition. King Not the Great, already ruler of England and Denmark, now set his sights on Norway and Sweden. His opponents, King Anund Jakob of Sweden and King Olaf Haraldsson of Norway, knew what was at stake. If they couldn't stop Not here, his North Sea Empire would become an unstoppable force. This wasn't just a battle for territory, it was a fight for the very balance of power in the Viking world. Nut's strategy was as bold as his ambitions. Unlike traditional Viking sea battles where fleets clashed head-on, he used the river itself as a weapon. Historical accounts suggest he ordered his men to dig trenches upstream, then suddenly release the pent-up waters as the enemy advanced. The resulting surge would have thrown Swedish and Norwegian ships into chaos, hulls colliding, oars snapping, warriors thrown overboard before the fighting even began. Whether this tactic was pure brilliance or embellished by later chroniclers, one thing is clear: Nut understood that victory required more than strength. It demanded innovation. The chaos of Helgia became a testament to Nut's growing legend. His forces, though not overwhelmingly superior in numbers, fought with the discipline of an empire builder. While Olaf and Anand Jakob's warriors were fierce, their alliance was fragile. Coordination between Swedish and Norwegian ships faltered under pressure, and Sea-Nut's seasoned troops exploited every gap. By nightfall, the river ran thick with shattered longships and the echoes of a decisive defeat. The Swedish-Norwegian alliance retreated, their hopes of containing Sea-Nut's empire dashed against the rocks of his ambition. But Helgia's true significance lay in what came after. With his rivals humbled, Sea-Nut tightened his grip on Scandinavia, weaving England, Denmark, and Norway into a single realm, the North Sea Empire. Trade routes flourished under his rule, silver flowing as freely as the rivers his ships once conquered. For the first time, a Viking king wasn't just raiding foreign shores, he was governing them, blending Norse traditions with the administrative savvy of a European monarch. The battle proved that Viking power could evolve beyond raids and plunder into something far more enduring, an empire built on strategy as much as steel. Yet even in victory, Sea-Nut faced the same lesson as every Viking conqueror before him: the sea gives power, but it never guarantees loyalty. His empire, though vast, would fracture after his death, a reminder that no ruler, no matter how brilliant, could truly bind the North Sea's restless waters. Helgia wasn't just the peak of Sea-Nut's reign. It was the moment Viking ambition reached its zenith and glimpsed its limits. The battle's legacy endures not in the wreckage left behind, but in the daring idea it represented, that a Viking could be more than a warrior. He could be a king of kings. The mists of time have a way of turning history into legend, and nowhere is that more true than at Hafrsfjord. Sometime in the 980s, on the plains near modern-day Uppsala, Swedish King Erik the Victorious faced an invasion that would cement his name in saga and song. Danish forces, led either by King Harald Bluetooth or his rebellious son Sweyn Forkbeard, the records disagree, had come to challenge Erik's rule. What followed wasn't just a battle, it became a cornerstone of Swedish national identity, even if the details have faded like runes on weathered stone. What makes Hafrsfjord so intriguing isn't the clarity of its history, but the power of its legacy. Unlike the well-documented clashes at Hafrsfjord or Svolder, this battle exists in fragments, scattered skaldic verses, half-remembered chronicles, and later sagas that blend fact with folklore. One enduring tale claims Erik lit massive beacons across the plains, creating a wall of fire to funnel the Danes into a deadly bottleneck. Another describes him sacrificing to Odin for victory, promising himself to the gods if they granted him 10 more years of rule. Whether these stories are true matters less than what they reveal. A king willing to become myth to defend his land. The battle's outcome, though shrouded, shaped Scandinavia's political landscape. Erik's victory, assuming he won, secured Sweden's independence at a time when Danish expansion threatened to overwhelm the region. His nickname, the Victorious, wasn't just propaganda. It reflected a reality where reputation was as vital as territory. Later rulers would invoke his name to legitimize their own reigns, tying their fortunes to his legend. Even the ambiguity served a purpose. Without clear records, Hafrsfjord became a canvas where each generation could paint its own ideals of courage and resistance. Yet the battle's true significance lies in what it represents, the twilight of the Viking Age's chaotic early years. By Erik's time, raids were giving way to kingdoms, and Hafrsfjord marked a shift from petty coastal skirmishes to large-scale, state-backed conflicts. The Danes weren't just raiders, they were a rival nation. Erik's defense wasn't just survival, it was statecraft. When the smoke cleared, whether by fire or fate, one message rang clear: Scandinavia's future would be decided not just by axes but by crowns. Hafrsfjord endures not because we know what happened, but because we need it to have happened. In a world where history and myth intertwine like serpentine carvings on a longship's prow, some battles transcend their moment to become symbols. For Sweden, this was the day a king stood firm against the tide, and whether the tide was Danish steel or the erosion of time hardly matters. The story remains, etched not in parchment, but in the soul of a people who remember, even when the details slip away. The summer of 986 should have been a time of triumph for the Danish king Harald Bluetooth. His fleet, swollen with loyal chieftains and seasoned warriors, outnumbered the Norwegian defenders nearly 2-1 as they sailed toward Aacher and Gavaga. Victory seemed certain until the weather itself turned traitor. What unfolded wasn't just a battle, but a masterclass in how Vikings could turn even nature into an ally. Jarl Hakon Sigurdsson, Norway's last great pagan ruler, faced impossible odds. With Harald's forces bearing down, he couldn't rely on brute strength alone. So he watched the skies as the Danish ships entered the narrow fjord near modern-day Ålesund. A sudden storm erupted, the kind that twists sails into shreds and turns decks into chaos. Hakon's men, intimately familiar with these waters, had anchored in sheltered coves. Harald's fleet, caught in open water, was battered by waves that scattered ships like driftwood. The Danes' numerical advantage meant nothing when half their vessels were fighting the sea instead of the enemy, but Hakon's genius lay in what he did next. Instead of waiting passively, he launched small, targeted attacks under cover of the storm. His lighter longships darted between the struggling Danish vessels, picking off stragglers while the Tempest did most of the work. By the time the skies cleared, Harald's invasion force was in tatters. The surviving Danes limped home, not just defeated but humiliated, outmaneuvered by a man who understood that true power came from reading the land and sky as carefully as any battle line. Aacher and Gavaga's legacy echoes far beyond its bloodied waters. Hakon's victory delayed Danish domination of Norway for decades, preserving a fragile independence that would later fuel the ambitions of kings like Olaf Tryggvason. It also revealed a paradox of Viking warfare. Even in defense, they fought like predators. Hakon didn't just repel an invasion, he turned his enemy's strength, their numbers, into their greatest weakness by letting the environment amplify his tactics. Yet the battle's aftermath carried an ironic twist. Hakon, the pagan hero who saved Norway, would later be overthrown by those same Christianizing forces Harald had championed. History remembers him not for his faith, but for the lesson he carved into the cliffs of Aacher and Gavaga, that the difference between victory and defeat often lies not in the sword arm, but in the ability to see the battlefield as more than just men and ships. Sometimes the wind and waves choose the winner. The autumn of 1062 turned the waters of Nisa into a churning battlefield, where two of Scandinavia's most formidable kings collided in a clash of raw ambition. King Harald Hardrada of Norway, the legendary Thunderbolt of the North, faced off against King Sweyn of Denmark, each commanding fleets so vast that chroniclers claimed the sea itself vanished beneath their hulls. This wasn't just a struggle for territory, it was a duel of egos fought by men who believed the northern seas belonged to them alone. Harald's strategy mirrored his reputation, relentless and direct. His flagship, towering above the Danish vessels, became the heart of the fighting, drawing Sweyn's forces into a brutal close-quarters melee. The battle quickly devolved into a grueling test of endurance, with warriors fighting shield to shield on decks slick with blood and seawater. Unlike earlier Viking battles that hinged on cunning maneuvers, Nisa was a contest of sheer willpower. Harald's veterans, hardened by decades of war from Byzantium to England, held the edge, but victory came at a horrifying cost. By dusk, the fjord was littered with shattered hulls and the bodies of fallen warriors, a grim testament to the price of supremacy. Yet the battle's true significance lay in its aftermath. Though Harald emerged victorious, his fleet was too battered to press the advantage. Sweyn, though humbled, lived to fight another day. The conflict dragged on for years, draining both kingdoms of men and resources without a decisive resolution. Nisa exposed a harsh truth. Even the mightiest Viking fleets had limits. Naval dominance required more than skilled warriors and sturdy ships. It demanded an economy capable of rebuilding losses, a population willing to endure endless war, and leaders who understood when to sheath the sword. The battle also marked a turning point in Viking warfare. Gone were the days of lightning raids and quick plunder. Nisa was a grinding, state-sponsored conflict foreshadowing the medieval wars to come. Harald, for all his prowess, would soon meet his fate not in the Baltic, but on English soil at Stamford Bridge, his ambitions finally outstripping his resources. Nisa wasn't just a battle, it was a warning, written in salt and blood, that even the sea's masters could drown in their own ambition. The river Humber lay eerily calm in September of 1066 as Harald Hardrada's fleet of 300 longships sliced through its waters. Fresh from his Pyrrhic victory at Nisa, the Norwegian king had set his sights on a far grander prize, England itself. With him marched Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of England's King Harold Godwinson, whispering promises of easy conquest. This wasn't just another raid, it was the culmination of a lifetime of Viking ambition, a gamble to carve a Norse kingdom from English soil. Yet history remembers Stamford Bridge not for its daring beginning, but for its brutal, unexpected end. What made this invasion so audacious was its timing. England stood on the brink of another invasion. William of Normandy's forces were massing across the Channel. Harold, ever the opportunist, saw weakness where others saw risk. His fleet landed unopposed near York, scattering local militias with ease. After centuries of Viking raids, the sight of dragon-prowed ships should have struck terror into English hearts. But this time, something was different. King Harold Godwinson, warned of the invasion, marched his army north at a pace that defied belief, covering over 180 miles in just 4 days. The Vikings, accustomed to leisurely plundering undefended coasts, suddenly found themselves outmaneuvered on their own terms. The battle itself unfolded like a saga's tragic final chapter. Caught off guard near Stamford Bridge, Hardrada's forces had barely time to don their armor. Legend claims a single Norse berserker held the narrow bridge against the entire English army, buying precious moments with his life. But no act of individual heroism could change the tide. The English, fighting for their homeland, cut through the Viking ranks with grim efficiency. By day's end, Hardrada lay dead, an arrow through his throat alongside Tostig and countless Norse warriors. The survivors fled to their ships, their dreams of conquest drowned in the river Derwent. Stamford Bridge's legacy stretches far beyond its bloodied fields. It marked the end of an era, the last great Viking attempt to conquer England. Just 19 days later, Harold Godwinson's exhausted forces would meet William at Hastings, falling to Norman arrows in a battle that reshaped English history. Had Hardrada succeeded, the very language we speak today might carry more Norse than French influences. Instead, his defeat signaled the closing chapter of Viking dominance. The longships would keep sailing, but never again with such world-shaking ambition. Yet there's poetry in the battle's timing. On September 25, 1066, the Viking Age didn't just end with a whimper. It went down swinging, sword in hand, against impossible odds. Hardrada, the last true Viking king, died as he'd lived, reaching for glory beyond reason. Stamford Bridge stands as a monument to that spirit, not of mindless violence, but of boundless daring. The seas that had carried Norse warriors to every corner of the known world finally, decisively, found their limit. The quiet waters of Roskilde Fjord hid a revolution in the making. In the summer of 1086, King Canute IV of Denmark, a ruler who clung fiercely to old Viking traditions, found himself facing an uprising not from foreign invaders, but from his own people. The farmers, merchants, and minor nobles who rallied against him weren't just rejecting his taxes, they were rejecting an entire era. This wasn't merely a battle, it was the death rattle of Viking kingship, where the clash of oars signaled the birth of something new. Canute's reign had been a study in contradictions. He was a devout Christian who nonetheless ruled with the iron fist of his pagan ancestors, demanding ever greater tributes to fund wars and churches alike. When he ordered a naval levy to invade England, echoing the ambitions of his namesake, Canute the Great, his subjects had reached their breaking point. As his fleet gathered in Roskilde fjord, rebels swarmed the shoreline, their makeshift barricades blocking escape. The king's longships, symbols of Viking power for centuries, became prisons as the fjord's narrow waters turned against them. What followed was less a battle than a massacre. Canute's forces, trapped and outnumbered, were picked apart by rebels who knew every inch of the coastline. Arrows rained from cliffs where fishermen once dried their nets. Farmers turned, warriors hurled stones from hidden coves. The king himself fled to the wooden church of St. Albans, seeking sanctuary, but the mob dragged him outside and cut him down on the steps. The moment was as symbolic as it was brutal. A king who embodied the old ways, slain at the threshold of the new faith he'd championed but never truly understood. Roskilde's aftermath rippled far beyond Denmark. Canute's death shattered the myth of Viking kings as untouchable warlords, proving even the most powerful ruler could fall to his own people. Within decades, Denmark's monarchy would evolve, trading raiding parties for bureaucracies and royal decrees. The fjord where Canute perished now holds a different treasure, the Viking Ship Museum, where salvaged longships rest not as weapons of war, but as relics of a fading age. Yet the battle's true legacy lies in what it whispered about power. The rebels of Roskilde didn't just kill a king, they killed an idea. No longer would Scandinavian rulers command unquestioning loyalty through sheer force. The sea that had once carried Vikings to glory now bore witness to their transformation, as the age of raiders gave way to the age of kingdoms. Roskilde Fjord's waters may be calm today, but beneath their surface stirs the memory of the day the North chose a different path. The Gulf of Riga in 1215 was no longer the domain of dragon-proud longships, but the ghosts of Viking tactics still haunted its waters. 2 centuries after the Viking Age's official end, their Scandinavian descendants now fought under the banners of kings and crosses, yet the stakes remained eerily familiar: control of the Baltic's lucrative trade routes. The Swedish and Danish fleets that clashed here weren't raiders in horned helmets. They were professional naval forces, yet their strategies bore the unmistakable imprint of their ancestors' cunning. What made this battle extraordinary was its reflection of how Viking maritime traditions had evolved. The Swedes, led by King Erik Knutsson, employed a classic feigned retreat, a tactic straight from the sagas, luring the Danish ships into shallow waters where their heavier vessels floundered. Meanwhile, Danish commander Albert of Riga countered with a shield wall of ships, lashed together to create floating fortresses reminiscent of those described at the Battle of Svolder. Even the weapons had transformed. Crossbows and early cannons now mingled with axes and spears, yet the fundamental dance of maneuver and counter-maneuver would have felt familiar to Harald Fairhair or Ragnar Lothbrok. The aftermath of Riga revealed a paradox. While the Swedes claimed tactical victory, neither side could secure lasting dominance over the Baltic trade. The real winners were the German merchants of the Hanseatic League, who exploited the Scandinavian rivalry to tighten their grip on regional commerce. It was a stark lesson. Viking descendants might still master naval combat, but the world had grown more complex. Wealth no longer flowed solely to those with the sharpest blades. It followed contracts, alliances, and the patient accumulation of influence. Yet the battle's true legacy lies in its bridging of eras. The men who fought at Riga likely sang songs of their Viking forebears even as they prayed to Christian saints. Their ships, though broader and higher-sided than longships, still carried the same restless spirit that once drove Norsemen to sail beyond the horizon. When the last arrows fell into the Gulf's cold waters, they marked not just another clash of kingdoms, but the enduring truth that the sea never forgets its masters. The age of Vikings had passed, but their shadow still stretched across the waves. The summer of 1227 brought a storm of steel to the fields and fjords near Borneherved, where the fading echoes of Viking glory met the rising tide of medieval Europe. King Valdemar II of Denmark, a ruler who still dreamed of a North Sea empire to rival Sea, not the Greats, faced an unlikely alliance: German princes, Saxon lords, and even rebellious Danish nobles who'd grown weary of his relentless campaigns. This wasn't just another border skirmish. It was a collision between Scandinavia's seafaring legacy and the continent's shifting political tides. Valdemar's strategy bore the fingerprints of Viking ingenuity, even if his forces no longer sailed in longships. Knowing the marshy terrain around Borneherved could neutralize his enemy's cavalry advantage, he lured the German coalition into a watery labyrinth where their knights floundered in the muck. His Danish infantry, trained to fight in tight formations reminiscent of shipboard shield walls, held the line with grim determination. For a moment, it seemed the old ways might triumph again until fortune turned. A contingent of German crossbowmen positioned on drier ground rained bolts down on Valdemar's flanks, while his own allied Slavic auxiliaries chose that pivotal moment to switch sides. The battle dissolved into chaos, and the Danish king barely escaped with his life. What makes Borneherved remarkable isn't just the bloodshed, it's the symbolism. The defeat shattered Valdemar's empire-building dreams, forcing Denmark to abandon its claims on northern Germany. More importantly, it highlighted how naval power alone could no longer sustain Scandinavian ambitions. The German coalition hadn't even needed to challenge Valdemar at sea. They'd outmaneuvered him on land, proving that the rules of power had changed. Trade routes now depended as much on treaties as on troop movements, and the Baltic's wealth flowed to those who could navigate courts as skillfully as currents. Yet the battle also revealed how deeply Viking tactics had seeped into Europe's military DNA. The German forces used feints and terrain exploitation that would have made Harald Fairhair nod in approval, while the Danes' disciplined formations echoed the ship-bound strategies of Hafrsfjord. Even in defeat, Valdemar's campaign showed that the spirit of the Vikings hadn't vanished. It had simply adapted, trading dragon prows for diplomacy, but still chasing the same timeless prize: dominance over the lands where the sea met the shore. Borneherved's legacy lingers in the quiet way it marked an ending and a beginning. The North would keep producing formidable sailors and warriors, but they'd fight for kings and currencies, not sagas and silver hoards. The battle's muddy fields, now peaceful farmland, whisper a truth every Viking descendant eventually learned. The world grows larger, and even the mightiest tides must someday ebb. Winter gripped Sweden's Lake Vättern in 1208, when two branches of the royal family turned its frozen shores into a battleground. King Sverker the Younger, backed by Danish allies, faced off against his rival Erik Knutsson in a conflict that would test whether Viking naval tactics still held power in an age of growing kingdoms and professional armies. The Battle of Lina wasn't just another clash for a crown. It was a proving ground where centuries of maritime tradition met the dawn of a new era. Sverker's strategy revealed how deeply Viking instincts ran, even in a changing world. Rather than risk a direct assault on Eric's fortified positions, he ordered his fleet to cut across the lake's icy waters, aiming to outflank the enemy by sea. The move mirrored the surprise coastal raids of old, but with a crucial difference: these weren't independent longships under rival jarls, but a coordinated royal navy. The vessels themselves had evolved, with higher sides to protect against arrows and reinforced decks for cavalry transport, yet their oars still moved to the same rhythmic chants that had powered Viking crews for generations. Eric's response showed how the old ways could still outmaneuver modernity. Anticipating Sverker's naval advance, he concealed a contingent of troops along the shoreline, using the terrain much as Harald Fairhair had at Hafrsfjord centuries earlier. As Sverker's ships approached, Eric's forces unleashed a hail of arrows and flaming projectiles, turning the lake into a death trap. The water, once a Viking highway, became a prison for Sverker's heavier, less agile vessels. Trapped between ice and enemy, the king's fleet was decimated, a stark reminder that superior numbers meant nothing without the flexibility of the past. Yet Lina's aftermath proved more nuanced than a simple triumph of tradition. Eric's victory secured his throne, but he ruled as a modern monarch, centralizing power and strengthening Sweden's European ties. The very ships he defeated would soon be replaced by broader, deeper drafted vessels designed for trade rather than raids. The battle marked a pivot point where Viking tactics won the day, but Viking culture quietly conceded to the inevitable tide of change. The men who fought at Lina still sang of Odin and Thor, but their children would build cathedrals. What makes Lina so compelling isn't just the clash of oars and arrows, but the way it captures history's quiet ironies. Sverker's defeat came not because he'd abandoned Viking strategy, but because his opponent wielded it better. For one last moment on a frozen Scandinavian lake, the ghost of the Longships proved it could still outfight the future. And then, like the ice melting in spring, that world faded not with a roar, but with the whisper of oars dipping into water for the last time. The icy Strait of Urisund in 1427 became the stage for a clash that would redefine power in the Baltic. King Eric of Pomerania, ruler of the Kalmar Union that united Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, faced an existential threat not from rival kings but from merchant ships. The Hanseatic League, a coalition of Germanic trading cities, had grown tired of Danish tolls controlling access to the Baltic's riches. Their fleet, though assembled by bankers and guildsmen, moved with the precision of a royal navy. What followed wasn't just a battle over coins, it was a contest over who truly ruled the northern seas, crowns or commerce. Eric's strategy would have made his Viking ancestors proud. Rather than meeting the Hanseatic fleet head-on in open water, he lured them into the narrow Øresund Strait, where Denmark's fortified coastal batteries could rain fire upon the tightly packed ships. The Hanseatic captains, accustomed to bullying smaller merchant vessels, suddenly found themselves trapped in a kill zone. Danish ballistae massive crossbows capable of punching through oak tore into their hulls, while Eric's own ships harried the flanks. It was Hafrsfjord's lesson centuries later. Terrain could turn even the mightiest fleet into prey, yet the battle's true brilliance lay in its timing. Eric had chosen to strike in late autumn when the Baltic's notorious storms made escape treacherous. As the Hanseatic ships scrambled to retreat, gale-force winds dashed many against the rocky Swedish coast. The merchants who'd grown fat on Baltic trade now choked on its waters, their cargoes of Flemish cloth and Novgorod furs sinking into the depths. For the first time in living memory, a king had outmaneuvered the Hansa at their own game, not with raiding parties, but with logistics, geography, and sheer audacity. Øresund's aftermath rippled across Europe. The Hanseatic League, though far from defeated, was forced to renegotiate the sound tolls that funded Denmark's treasury for generations. More importantly, the battle proved that Scandinavia's naval tradition hadn't vanished with the last longship, it had evolved. Viking raiders became royal admirals, coastal ambushes transformed into calculated blockades. The sea remained the lifeblood of northern power, even as the players changed. But the battle also whispered a warning. Eric's victory came not from wooden ships alone, but from stone fortresses and forged steel, the tools of a centralized state. The age of individual captains carving out kingdoms was over. Now, control of the waves required tax collectors, engineers, and diplomats as much as warriors. Urisund stood as a monument to that transition, where the ghost of Viking ambition learned to wear a crown. The cobblestone streets of Stockholm ran red on October 10, 1471, but the real battle had already been won at sea. When Danish King Christian I invaded Sweden to reclaim the throne for the Kalmar Union, he expected a swift victory. What he got was a masterclass in how Viking-era naval strategy could still shape battles fought centuries later. Though Brunkeberg is remembered for the brutal land clash where future Swedish regent Sten Sture the Elder rallied peasants against armored knights, the unseen hero of the day was Sweden's makeshift fleet. Sture understood what Christian overlooked: control the waterways and you control the war. While Danish ships blockaded Stockholm's harbor, Swedish sailors used shallow draft vessels, direct descendants of Viking longships in function if not form, to slip through the archipelago's maze of islands. These agile boats ferried troops and supplies under cover of darkness, keeping Stockholm's defenders supplied despite the siege. More crucially, they cut Christian's supply lines, leaving his army stranded without reinforcements. The tactic mirrored Viking coastal raids so precisely it's as if Harald Hardrada himself whispered the plan across time. When the armies finally collided at Brunkeberg's Ridge, the Danes faced an enemy buoyed by naval success. Sture's forces, though outnumbered, fought with the confidence of men who knew their flanks were secure. Meanwhile, Christian's troops, aware their escape routes were compromised, faltered at critical moments. The decisive moment came when Swedish ships disguised as Danish reinforcements sailed into the harbor, spreading panic through enemy ranks. A deception worthy of Odin, the trickster god himself. Brunkeberg's legacy lies in this paradox: a medieval battle won by medieval knights, yet decided by principles forged in the Viking Age. The ships that secured Sweden's independence weren't longships, but their spiritual successors carried the same strategic DNA: speed over strength, cunning over numbers. For all the armor and crossbows on display that day, the real weapon was something far older: the understanding that in the north, victory often belongs to those who master both land and sea. Yet the battle also marked an ending. However effective these tactics remained, Brunkeberg would be one of the last major Scandinavian conflicts where naval maneuvers felt so distinctly Norse. Within decades, gunpowder and standing armies would reshape warfare beyond recognition. The ghosts of Viking admirals watching from Valhalla might have smiled that day, but they also would have known their time was passing. Stockholm's harbor still bears witness to that twilight moment, where the echoes of dragon prows faded beneath the thunder of cannons. The cannons roared over Copenhagen's harbor on April 2, 1801, but the shadows of Viking sails still loomed over the battle. Denmark's navy, though centuries removed from the longships of Ragnar Lothbrok, carried their ancestors' defiance into the age of empires. This wasn't just a clash between Britain's Royal Navy and a Scandinavian fleet. It was a test of whether the seafaring spirit that once made Vikings the terror of Europe could survive the era of gunpowder and globalization. Admiral Lord Nelson's British fleet arrived with overwhelming firepower. but the Danes fought with a cunning that would have made their Viking forebears nod in approval. Instead of meeting the British head-on in open water, they anchored their ships in a defensive line beneath the guns of Copenhagen's fortresses, forcing Nelson to navigate a deadly gauntlet of crossfire. The tactic mirrored Viking harbor defenses from 1,000 years earlier, using the coastline itself as a weapon. Danish sailors, many descended from generations of Baltic traders and fishermen, knew these shallow waters like the lines on their hands. When British ships ran aground under heavy fire, it became clear that naval supremacy wasn't just about firepower, but about understanding the sea's secrets. Yet the battle's turning point came from something far older than cannons: psychology. Nelson, famously turning a blind eye to his superior's signal to retreat, pressed the attack with a gambit straight from the Saga's bluffing victory, even as his ships burned. The Danes, though inflicting heavy losses, ultimately chose negotiation over annihilation. In that moment, two maritime traditions collided: Britain's imperial might against Scandinavia's enduring instinct for survival. The Vikings had always known when to trade instead of fight, and their descendants remembered that lesson even as smoke choked the sky. Copenhagen's legacy lies in its paradox. Though Denmark lost the battle, its navy earned enough respect to preserve the kingdom's independence. The wooden ships that burned that day were the last heirs of Viking shipbuilding, soon to be replaced by steam and steel. Yet the strategic principles using terrain, knowing when to pivot from war to diplomacy, remained timeless. When Nelson called it the hardest battle I ever fought, he unwittingly paid tribute to a lineage of naval brilliance stretching back to the fjords. The sea hadn't changed, only the men upon it. The grey North Sea churned with steel and smoke in May 1916 as history's greatest fleets collided off Denmark's Jutland coast. Over 250 warships, British Grand Fleet against Germany's High Seas Fleet, unleashed firepower unimaginable to Viking raiders. Yet the echoes of their maritime legacy lingered beneath the thunder of artillery. This wasn't just a battle for naval supremacy. It was proof that Scandinavia's waters remained a crucible of conflict, where centuries after the last longship sailed, the same current still carried men to war. What made Jutland extraordinary wasn't just its scale. Though the 6,000 lives lost and 25 ships sunk dwarfed any Viking clash, but how Viking Age instinct survived in the age of dreadnoughts. German Admiral Reinhard Scheer, like a Norse Jarl outmaneuvering a stronger foe, lured the British into a trap using feigned retreats and tight formations. British Admiral John Jellicoe, meanwhile, mirrored the defensive tactics of Viking coastal kings, using Denmark's shallow banks to limit enemy movement. Even the weather, ever a Viking ally, played its part. Thick mist and fading light allowed Germany's outgunned fleet to escape, just as sudden storms had saved Jarl Håkon at Aacher and Gavaga 9 centuries earlier. Yet Jutland also revealed how warfare had transformed. The battle's indecisive outcome, both sides claimed victory, proved that modern navies, for all their firepower, still struggled to achieve what Viking fleets once did: total domination. Torpedoes replaced boarding axes, wireless signals supplanted horn blasts, but the fundamental challenge remained: how to control waters that refused to be tamed. The North Sea, just as in Ragnar Lothbrok's time, mocked those who underestimated its power. The battle's legacy stretches far beyond World War I. Danish fishermen still haul up twisted metal from the seabed: artillery shells, portholes, the occasional sailor's boot, reminders that these waters never forget. Viking descendants watched from neutral Denmark as foreign fleets fought over the same trade routes their ancestors once raided. The lesson was clear: whether with oars or turbines, the sea rewards those who respect its rhythms. Jutland's smoke has long cleared, but the waves still whisper of the day the North reminded the world that naval warfare began here, and its spirit never truly left. The true measure of Viking naval dominance wasn't just in the battles they won, it was in the blueprint they left behind. Long after the last longship rotted away, their innovations continued to shape how nations fought on water. Picture this: sleek, shallow-drafted vessels capable of crossing oceans yet sliding effortlessly up rivers, a design so revolutionary that modern special forces still study it for covert operations. The Vikings didn't just build ships, they engineered a system of mobility and surprise that turned the sea into a weapon. Their longships became the stealth fighters of the medieval world, striking without warning and vanishing before retaliation could be organized. What set Viking warfare apart wasn't just technology, but mentality. While other cultures saw navies as extensions of land armies, the Vikings treated their ships as living entities, part warrior, part wind horse. A raiding party could disembark, loot a monastery, and be back at sea before local forces mustered. This blend of naval and ground tactics, later dubbed amphibious warfare, wouldn't be seen again on such a scale until World War II. Even their infamous shield walls on deck foreshadowed the disciplined formations of later naval infantry. The Vikings didn't just fight on the water, they fought with it, using tides, currents, and even ice as tactical tools. The ripple effects of their ingenuity stretch far beyond the medieval period. When Spanish galleons patrolled the Caribbean, their high decks and broadside cannons owed a debt to Viking hull stability principles. Napoleon's admirals studied Norse coastal raids to refine their blockade strategies, and during D-Day, Allied planners drew inspiration from Viking river penetrations to orchestrate history's largest amphibious invasion. The thread connecting these moments, a recognition that controlling the sea means controlling the tempo of war, a lesson the Vikings mastered a millennium earlier. Yet perhaps their most enduring legacy lies in the intangible. Viking culture celebrated seamanship not as a skill, but as identity. Their sagas wove naval victories into myth, reinforcing that a true leader must command both land and water. This ethos birthed the naval traditions of Scandinavia, where kings like Gustavus Adolphus and Christian Roman IV built fleets that dominated the Baltic. Even today, Scandinavian navies punch above their weight, their strategies infused with that Old Norse blend of pragmatism and audacity. The sea wasn't just a battlefield for the Vikings, it was a classroom, and their lessons still resonate wherever waves meet ambition. The next time you see a modern warship slicing through the waves, remember, its DNA traces back to the dragon-proud vessels that once ruled the North. The Vikings may have faded into history, but their naval revolution sails on in the stealth of submarines, the speed of destroyers, and the unshakable truth that whoever masters the sea masters the game of empires. The ripple effects of Viking naval battles stretched far beyond the fjords. Each clash sent shockwaves through Europe that would reshape the continent for centuries. Take the siege of Paris in 845. When Ragnar Lothbrok's fleet extracted that colossal ransom, it didn't just fill Norse coffers, it exposed the fragility of Frankish defenses, accelerating the decentralization of power that would eventually birth feudalism. Viking raids didn't just plunder wealth, they destabilized empires, creating power vacuums where new kingdoms could rise. The Danegeld payments demanded by Norse warlords forced European rulers to develop taxation systems, laying the groundwork for modern bureaucracies. Even the word tax in some Slavic languages still echoes the Old Norse taska, meaning to take, a linguistic relic of Viking extortion tactics. Trade routes tell an equally transformative story. Before the Vikings, Europe's commerce huddled along Roman roads and Mediterranean coasts. but Norse longships capable of navigating rivers and open seas alike stitched together a sprawling network from Baghdad to Newfoundland. The Volga trade route, guarded by Viking fleets, became a superhighway for Islamic silver flowing into Scandinavia, while their Dublin and York settlements evolved into hubs that connected Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Frankish markets. These weren't just raids, they were the first stirrings of globalization, with Viking ships as the container ships of their age. The very geography of power shifted beneath their keels. Cities like Kiev and Novgorod rose to prominence under Viking rulers, while traditional centers like Dorstad withered under repeated attacks. Cultural exchange flowed as freely as trade goods. Viking battles often ended not just with burned monasteries, but with intermarriage and assimilation. In Normandy, Rollo's warriors adopted French customs so thoroughly that within generations, their descendants spoke Romance languages and built castles instead of longhouses, yet retained the naval prowess that would let William the Conqueror cross the Channel. Meanwhile, Norse settlers in Ireland introduced urban planning to Gaelic society, founding waterfront towns like Waterford and Limerick that still bear Viking street patterns. Even England's identity was forged in this crucible. The Great Heathen Armies campaigns led to the blending of Old English and Old Norse that simplified English grammar, giving us pronouns like they and their instead of the cumbersome Germanic forms. The most enduring legacy, however, lies in the political maps we take for granted today. Viking pressure fragmented Charlemagne's empire into smaller, more defensible states, accelerating the rise of France and Germany as distinct nations. Their raids on Moorish Iberia inadvertently strengthened Christian resistance, shaping the Reconquista. And when not the Great ruled England, Denmark, and Norway simultaneously, he created a template for North Sea empires that later monarchs would spend centuries trying to recreate. The very concept of a kingdom of the sea owes its existence to Viking admirals who proved that power could be projected across water as effectively as land. Yet perhaps the greatest testament to their influence is how thoroughly Europe absorbed Viking innovations while forgetting their origins, the naval tactics that won Hastings in 1066. Refined from Norse boarding techniques, the Russian river trade that made Moscow powerful, built on Viking portage routes. Even the parliamentary systems of Iceland and the Isle of Man trace their roots to Viking assemblies called things. The battles we've explored weren't just isolated conflicts, they were the chisel strikes that carved modern Europe from the marble of antiquity. When the last longship sailed, it left behind a continent forever altered, not by the terror of raids alone, but by the unintended consequences of a people who fought as fiercely as they adapted. The Vikings didn't just visit Europe, they helped invent it. By the 12th century, the world the Vikings had known was vanishing beneath the tides of change. The same seas that once carried their longships to every corner of Europe now bristled with the fortified hulls of royal navies and the towering masts of trade cogs. Kingdoms like England and Denmark had grown too strong, their castles too high, their ports too well defended for the old hit-and-run tactics to work. But the end of Viking naval dominance wasn't just about stronger walls or bigger armies. It was a revolution in how power itself was organized. Centralization killed the Viking way of war. Where once a charismatic Jarl could rally a fleet with promises of silver and glory, now only kings could afford the new tools of naval combat. Heavy ships with towering forecastles for archers, siege engines capable of hurling stones instead of spears, and most crucially, standing fleets that patrolled year-round. The Viking longship, designed for speed and stealth, suddenly seemed fragile against these floating fortresses. When Norway's King Sverre tried to revive classic Viking tactics at the Battle of Fimrate in 1184, his lighter ships were crushed beneath the weight of his rivals' broader, taller vessels. The message was clear: the age of the independent raider was over. Yet in their twilight, the Vikings gifted the world a naval legacy that would outlast their longships. Their innovations in hull design, the overlapping planks, the flexible keels became the foundation for medieval shipbuilding from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. The navigational skills that let them cross the Atlantic without compasses were studied by explorers like Columbus and Magellan. Even their tactics lived on. The amphibious assaults perfected by Norse raiders would inspire everything from Norman invasions to modern marine landings. The paradox of the Viking naval decline is that it coincided with their greatest cultural conquest. As their ships faded from the seas, their descendants sat on thrones from Normandy to Kiev, weaving Norse bloodlines and traditions into the fabric of Europe. The last Viking fleets didn't vanish, they evolved, merging with the very kingdoms they once terrorized. When Danish King Valdemar the Great launched his crusading fleet into the Baltic in the 1200s, his ships carried crosses, not dragon heads, but their oars still moved to rhythms first chanted by pagan warriors. What truly ended wasn't Viking skill, but Viking scale. The sea remained a highway for their descendants, traders, explorers, kings, but never again would a single culture dominate it so completely. The waves that once answered to Norse prows now carried Hanseatic merchants, Genos galleys, and English men of war. Yet in quiet ways, the Vikings never left. Every time a ship's captain reads the wind like a saga, or a navy exploits shallow waters for ambush, the Old Norse whispers endure. The 12th century didn't bury Viking naval genius, it scattered it to every shore their longships ever touched, a legacy as deep and restless as the sea itself. From the siege of Paris to the twilight of their dominance, the Vikings ruled the northern seas through sheer skill and audacity. These 20 battles weren't just fights, they were the engines of history, each one a turning point that reshaped kingdoms, redirected trade, and rewrote the rules of naval warfare. The Vikings didn't just leave behind sagas and ruins, they left a blueprint for how power could be won and lost on the waves. Their legacy isn't measured solely in the silver they plundered or the lands they claimed, but in the indelible mark they left on the world's imagination. Think about it, how many cultures can claim to have inspired both fear and fascination for over 1,000 years? The Vikings were more than raiders, they were explorers who reached North America centuries before Columbus, traders who connected Constantinople to Dublin, and innovators whose ship designs revolutionized seafaring. Their battles weren't mindless violence, they were calculated gambles where every oar stroke and arrow carried the weight of ambition. When Ragnar Lothbrok sailed up the Seine or Harald Fairhair fell at Stamford Bridge, they weren't just fighting for loot, they were fighting for legend. And what legends they left behind! The mere sight of a dragon-prowed ship could send entire villages fleeing inland. Yet those same ships carried settlers who built thriving communities from Iceland to Russia. The Vikings mastered the art of transformation, shifting seamlessly from raiders to rulers, pagans to kings, pirates to empire builders. Their greatest weapon wasn't the axe or the shield wall, it was adaptability. They could be the terror of Paris one day and the founders of Normandy the next, proving that true power lies not in destruction, but in reinvention. As the waves of time roll on, the echoes of Viking longships still whisper in the wind. You can hear it in the rhythmic creak of a wooden hull, in the navigational tricks still used by sailors today, even in the political boundaries they helped draw. The North Sea might no longer tremble at the sight of a fleet, but the lessons of those battles endure. Control the sea, and you control the story. If you enjoyed this voyage through history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Which of these battles surprised you the most? Could you imagine yourself standing on the deck of a longship, staring down the horizon? Let's keep the conversation going. Until next time,